Good morning, good afternoon to everybody joining us on today's webinar. This is Dave Handelsman from DWise, and today's session is going to be focused on understanding how SAS can be modernized for your organization in terms of conducting and managing clinical research activities. We know SAS is widely used in clinical development and clinical research, excuse me, and we're hearing more and more questions from biopharmaceutical companies, CROs, medical device developers, and other participants in the clinical research industries about how to take their existing SAS implementations and really get the most value out of those, and how to bring them into sometimes into a more modern environment. So that's going to be the focus of today's webinar. I do have a few logistical things to cover. If we can go to the next slide. So we're going to run this. We're going to run about for an hour, 45 minutes of content, 15 minutes of time left over for discussion and questions and answers. Everybody attending the webinar is in listen-only mode to avoid some of the background noise you sometimes do hear on these kinds of sessions. We are providing the ability to ask questions through a questions tab on the GoToWebinar applications on the right-hand side. Just click on questions, and you should be able to add questions as necessary, and we will answer them at the end of the session. If you run into any difficulties, you can also use the chat window to contact me or one of the other DWise employees as we continue on through the webinar. With that, I'm going to turn over the webinar to Stephen Baker. Stephen is one of our technology executives here at DWise, and he's been very actively engaged with a number of companies in terms of helping them identify the best approaches to modernize their SAS implementations and to lead them down the path of doing that job successfully. With that, I will turn it over to Stephen.
Thank you, Dave. We've got quite a good audience attending at this point, and I know we have a few folks who are going to join in after the fact. So again, as Dave mentioned, with a large audience, oftentimes it's easiest to put everybody on mute, but we do want to hear from you, so we would encourage you throughout the presentation to ask questions via the GoToWebinar panel, and we can open up the audio at the end if necessary if folks have topics that are harder to put forward in text. So thanks everybody for joining. I would like to just sort of start out by saying that, as Dave mentioned, our context today is to talk about modernization and what does modernization actually mean in the world of SAS. DWise helps clients across a continuum of process, standards, and technology in the life sciences industry, and we do that across both the commercial and the research and development sides of the business because both have needs in this regard. But today we're going to be focused precisely on SAS, and as we get through the motions here, folks will see why some of the experience we've had has been really helpful, and hopefully it'll be interesting for you. We'd be glad to have an opportunity to discuss being part of your modernization initiatives internally. So we've got 5 content sections. The first is going to talk about modernization readiness. We're going to follow that with some success factors that help to drive successful implementations. We're going to sort of set a context that implementation and adoption are two different things, and where they sort of meet in the middle is around migration. So third, we're going to talk about how to manage change during migration because that's a real driver of a successful outcome. Towards the end of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the licensing options that SAS offers clients in order to actually establish a relationship with them as a vendor and get the technology to their users. I'll go ahead and set the context that DWise is by no means in the business of offering licenses from SAS. Clients always negotiate those directly with SAS, and what we're providing here is just some frame of reference about what license models we're aware exist from having seen clients deploy them. But as you talk to your account executives, you may find other options available or variants to the options we're going to discuss. And at the end, we'll talk about a couple of websites at DWise where you can find some more information and give you some details on how to get in touch with us if you'd like to continue the discussion. So without further ado, let's get into modernization readiness. What I'd like to say first is that modernization is kind of an industry buzzword here in the last few years. We want to set the stage here that when we're talking about modernization, what we're thinking about is taking advantage of the new technologies, the new license models, the new architectures that are available from SAS that they've brought to the marketplace in order to really deploy the most functionality to the business to help drive the outcomes that all of the different business units seek to achieve. There are three well-known deployment models for SAS, and over the last 20 years, there's sort of been a pendulum swing here between architectures that are more centralized on the desktop and architectures that are more centralized on a server, and more recently, architectures that are really enabled for mobile users on either phones or tablets. The three architectures we're going to drive this presentation around are PC SAS, Server SAS, and Grid SAS. And PC SAS folks are probably familiar with. This is the old standby where you actually have SAS deployed right there on your laptop or your desktop. And your installation is yours alone and everything runs locally. Oftentimes as organizations grow, there's a desire to provide more power to the users than you could actually do in a laptop setting. But recognizing that usage might not be consistent. And so there's an efficiency to be had by creating a model that allows you to share it. So server-based architectures were the answer to that business problem, and SAS provides two platforms for sort of going into a server model. The first is called Server SAS, and the second is called Grid SAS. And Grid SAS is basically just a flavor of Server SAS that includes some additional middleware. That middleware is a product from IBM called LSF Grid. And what that middleware does is it introduces a number of administrative and on-demand features for configuration, availability, and agility that are not natively available in some of the other SAS architectures. So it's a very exciting deployment strategy for people who are at the right scale. Before we get into talking about some of the success factors and the drivers, we want to also visit what is involved when we talk about SAS. You probably have experiences with your users where people say SAS is broken, and what they actually mean is Citrix isn't working, or their account is locked out, or the data wasn't available. There's lots of things in play here. So SAS is a code editing environment and a code execution environment. And what the language allows you to do is to access data, to manipulate data, and to sort of massage raw data into a target structure that you would like, to run analytics and reports and produce those and distribute them to a broader audience. So, fundamentally, those are the features, and they're accomplished by providing compute resources, features for security and metadata. There's oftentimes a collection of what we call SAS assets. This is the files and the programs. In some cases, these are all SAS things, and in some cases, they're not. In some cases, they're flat files or Excel files or maybe even a database. But in any case, those code and data assets are fundamental to why you have SAS and what you use it to accomplish. Some organizations take SAS a step further and actually build business applications using SAS solutions. So this is a little bit different than writing one program to produce one report. This might be developing a framework to configure a report or to go through a selection process to pick the right data. Business applications written in SAS sometimes even have client interfaces that allow you to have windowing and the like. And in other cases, there are applications not written in SAS that integrate with SAS using a solution called integration technologies to allow the power of SAS to be exposed to a Java environment or a Perl environment or a web environment. There's also supporting infrastructure in play, storage tier, the client tier, things like Citrix. These are oftentimes part of a server-based SAS deployment and easy to sort of oversee or forget about when you think about SAS because they're part of the mix, but they're not SAS-specific solutions. SAS also has introduced a couple of offerings that are more solution-oriented. So SAS is a platform. Visual analytics or visual statistics and business intelligence are two examples of solutions that SAS offers that the life sciences industry has been adopting and is adopting more feverishly in the context of visual analytics here recently to deploy the power of SAS in a little bit different way. Some of these solutions have web-delivered capabilities that are a little bit different than the typical client install pattern. Some of them provide ways to drag and drop and go through an experience that's a little bit less code-oriented to allow the functionality to be exposed to users who might not have a background in coding, but who might know a lot about analytics. In any case, those solutions will be part of the mix as well. And everything we've talked about so far is really technology. The other thing that's in the mix here is the users. And so there are people in your organization, and they execute processes in order to accomplish business operations. Some users will be part of multiple processes. Some users might use multiple systems. And as you think about making a change and making an opportunity to modernize available to them, acknowledging that there are people who do work today and will do work differently tomorrow is important. So why are organizations thinking about modernization, and what does it mean for them? We got several bullets here I'm going to go through and sort of just speak to the details. As you think about your SaaS environment today, maybe you have something that's very recent, but oftentimes what we find is clients have a deployment strategy that was based on decisions made several years ago when business conditions were a little bit different, or even licensing conditions were a little different. Maybe you had 8 users and now you have 50. Maybe you had 500 users and now you have 2,000 because of an acquisition. Maybe the mix between research and development or discovery or operations or commercial has changed. So as those business needs change, it'd be no accident that the legacy architecture might not be set up in a way that best meets them today. It also might not be set up in a way that best meets them 2 or 3 years from now. And depending on what your roadmap looks like and where you see your activities coming, it's important to get your SaaS environment ready so that you're not having to react to a regulatory filing or a commercial opportunity without having an infrastructure in place that enables the business to do the things they need to do. Licensing is another reason that modernization sometimes is a topic. Some of you may have the experience where there's a license for people on the West Coast and another license for people on the East Coast, and maybe even another license for users in Europe or China, maybe multiple licenses for all of these. A lot of organizations are thinking about taking an enterprise perspective on licensing these days and looking for a way to have that negotiation in a centralized fashion with SaaS. And when you do that, consolidating that has some benefits in thinking about the purchasing dynamic, but it also means you need to revisit how you're thinking about enterprise licensing as a strategy, not just as a tactical activity, but how are you thinking about it as a strategy? A third reason people are modernizing is to take advantage of the new technologies that are available. I mentioned visual analytics and visual statistics. Visual exploration and discovery are very hot topics right now, and they're ways people are getting more value out of their assets. And introducing technologies like that to the business provides a nice reason to think about modernization across the SaaS platform. We already spoke to simplifying licenses, so I'll move right into dynamically managing the infrastructure. PC SaaS, the desktop version that we mentioned before, people are very familiar with this. When you get a new user, they need a new PC. You put SaaS on it, you're off to the races. But that might not be the optimal model. It might be that what you'd like to have is a large server that can execute big jobs, and that server can be shared between 2 or 3 different business units. And at any point in time, you might need the ability to say what the mix of resources available is to those 2 or 3 different business units. Is it an equal share? Is it 60-20-20? How do you optimize the utilization of those hardware and software assets to provide the functionality you need today, which might be different than what you needed yesterday, and might be different than what you needed tomorrow? So some of these architectures have features that help support that, and taking those features live is one of the reasons people are thinking about modernizing. So a few success factors we're going to discuss here in the next section are things that DWise has experienced through our work with clients and our work with SAS as their marquee partner for this space that really help people to take new SaaS technologies and new architectures forward and get real value out of them. So on this slide, we've got the graphic that we started this deck with, which is the familiar iceberg pattern, which is often used to illustrate the notion that there are the visible known dynamics, and then there are the less visible, perhaps unknown dynamics. And when you think about an enterprise technology change and really building out something that's enterprise quality, this is really a good metaphor, because there are pieces of this that are very visible, like the version of SaaS and the server it goes on. There are pieces that are a little bit less visible, like how will it impact people from an end user perspective. What's the governance model that might be necessary? So there's a lot of factors that are in play, and DWise has been working with clients for the last decade to help with these modernization activities. More recently, a lot of that attention has been around SAS Grid, and we have adapted what many of you will recognize as sort of common software development lifecycle patterns to meet the needs of the specific challenges and opportunities that exist when you think about SAS. So what we've got illustrated here is sort of a serial sequence of events running from assessment, design, implementation, all the way through to run. We're going to talk about those a little bit, but the context here is to just acknowledge that at the beginning of the exercise, we're justifying the business case and we're getting everybody aligned so that we can do a design that allows us to implement. But as you move left to right, a lot of these activities should happen in parallel. They should be started early, not started at the end of the prior activity, which might be more common in a waterfall pattern. And the reason that it's important to do that is that there's codependencies between them, and having a shared sense of purpose and of the future state across the work streams really drives success. So starting them sort of in a non-serial fashion is really important. While you're going through the tactical effort to build the system, there's two other things that are part of our methodology that we think really help to drive success, and one is about managing the change. Again, this isn't really a SAS-specific thing, but nonetheless, when you change technology, when you change process, there's a disruption to the normal patterns that the users are familiar with, and everybody prefers what they're comfortable with to something that's new, even if the something new might be better. So as you go through the process of trying to get the business aligned, as you go through the process of trying to do the design and trying to roll things out to the users, inevitably you're going to encounter pockets of resistance, pockets of concern, and it's important to figure out the right communication and messaging strategy and governance strategies to make sure that everybody hears the messages that you want them to hear, and that everything is planned in a manner that results in sort of limited shock. And that entire process gets the right amount of attention, because if it doesn't, those little pockets of resistance will create laggards, and they'll interrupt the adoption cycle. And the goal here is to allow modernization to result in a new platform and the retirement of a legacy platform and the delivery of something innovative and more capable than what you had before. And that requires a successful adoption. And a successful adoption is just not going to happen without thinking about how to manage the change. We also have a chevron here that sort of illustrates a support center of excellence. And this is a concept that both SAS and DWise subscribe to. When you deploy analytics at scale of the organization, inevitably you're going to have questions. There's going to be a need for best practices. And when you build out something new, it's important to recognize that the support infrastructure that you had in the past was designed for an environment that's no longer your current state. And it needs to be revisited to create the right escalation path and the right knowledge assets so that your users can get the information that they need and know how to ask questions so that they can be successful. So going through that methodology, we've identified a few things that we're calling key challenges here, but this isn't to say that these things are impossible to overcome. They're just often things that people are disappointed to maybe not have given enough attention to at the right point in the process. And the last thing on the list really sort of calls that out, but we're going to go through the leaders here to just set the stage. So when you think about an enterprise SaaS model and modernizing from something that was maybe designed a few years ago, there are a lot of stakeholders involved. There's the business units, there's the managers who manage the resources themselves, there's IT, there's procurement. This is a wide variance of perspectives and objectives. And getting these folks together to align at an enterprise level on a licensing strategy and on a deployment strategy, it requires a coordinated effort. Having the right outside expertise to help answer questions and escalate decision points and make sure the right decisions are made at the right times can make sure that the organization starts in an aligned fashion and moves forward with continued alignment, and that any deviance from it can be addressed and sort of brought to the right level of attention. So when you go through that process, one of the things you'll want to facilitate is figuring out the business objectives that each of these different stakeholders seeks to accomplish. And inevitably, there's just a natural preference to think about what we did yesterday as a baseline for what we should do tomorrow. And that feeds into the next bullet, which speaks to the design accommodating today's operational needs and tomorrow's agility needs. These two are really correlated, right? The need here is to recognize that other people have already modernized their SAS environments. Some of the things that need to be figured out have been figured out. Reinventing the wheel is probably not the optimal strategy for success. So you want to leverage the learnings that the industry has already brought forward and that vendors like DWise can provide to make sure that your objectives are sort of fact-checked against what best practices are. So you don't head down the path of building something that's so fit for purpose and so bespoke that it requires you to blaze new trails that other people may have already blazed and found that there is, in fact, the right way to do this. And moving into the design accommodating today's needs and tomorrow's needs, this, again, is one of the key reasons people seek to modernize. Again, the challenge here is recognizing that it's our natural perspective to think about what we're doing right now as what we might need 2 or 3 years from now. And in reality, we all know that's rarely the case. We see things that we plan 90 days in advance that change before 90 days pass. And so you want to think about modernizing to build an environment that both minimizes the disruption of the business by providing some continuity of experience that allows you to scale and allows you to be agile as your needs change. As an acquisition might happen, as a new product comes to market, as a new discovery results in a landslide of trials, you need to be able to adapt. And so thinking about yesterday is the wrong place to start. You really want to start with a roadmap that thinks 2 or 3 years in the future, aligning your licensing to that, aligning your requirements to that, and making sure that everything comes together in the right fashion. Primarily, the last bullets, execution and change management and the risk profile, speak to thinking about how do you take a approach to go through implementation that results in success. So the first bullet speaks to the fact that minimizing those pockets of resistance and sort of acknowledging that there is a disruption here happening to the end users is real. And a successful enterprise adoption will create a project plan and life cycle, a training and messaging strategy that gives the maximum flexibility to minimize business disruption. And this just isn't about making people happy or making it easy. It's really about making sure that ongoing activities and timelines don't get impacted, because all of you have existing studies and existing deadlines. And the fact that you're changing technology under the covers, that doesn't change the fact that those deadlines are real. And so planning around that is really important. And one of the things that you can take into context when doing that planning is what is the risk profile of modernization. And we've got some content around that on the subsequent slides, so I'm just going to leave that as a sort of a placeholder to remember that the risk profile isn't level. There are points where the risk is higher, and there are points where the risk is lower. Acknowledging those, planning accordingly, results in a path to success. So next, we're going to go through some details on managing change during a migration and during an implementation. This is really sort of the perspective dynamic of the presentation, where we're going to give you some color on what DWise has seen with our experience with clients. So success modernizing SAS really requires that we plan accordingly, that there's a difference between implementation and adoption. We've spoken to this a couple of times. It's probably not news to folks on the phone, but it's very easy to think that we'll just install the system and natively it'll become our operating platform and everything will work. When you modernize a technology infrastructure, that's just not the case. We've got to get users prepared. We've got to make sure the platform is ready to sort of minimize any surprises they might experience. And so you really want to invest appropriately, not just in the build of the system, but in the adoption of the system. And the risk profile is really what's called out here in the second bullet. The actual build of a modern infrastructure and the migration to a modern infrastructure are not high-risk activities. They're well known. They have very precise technical things that are required. There are known skill sets that can execute them. But in order for that to be the case, you really have to invest appropriately in making sure that the design and migration readiness, the migration planning, get the right amount of attention. Because implementation won't be a root activity if we find out that our design wasn't fully informed. Migration won't be a root activity if we find out that we've got 20 gigabytes of SAS code that leverage a technology that we failed to include in our future state. So recognizing that the risk is higher during the design and during the planning for migration means that you can put the right amount of attention on it and enable the activities that flow out of that to be much lower risk and much more root, and something that you can perhaps even leverage some internal talent to help deliver. I already spoke to the concept of having a shared sense of purpose about the current and future state, but this is really important in managing the risk profile. Oftentimes there'll be decisions that are brought to light as people become aware of things. Maybe decisions are even revisited. And the goal is generally here to provide something that's more simple and something that offers better capabilities. Having that same vision and some understanding of why decisions were made and some continuity of knowledge means that you don't get caught up in the process of revisiting all the decisions that already have been made and slowing down the path to adoption. Because once the decision has been made, the goal should be to get that functionality in the hands of the business as quickly as possible. The next bullet speaks specifically to grid. I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation that grid is really an architecture that lends itself to flexibility and configuration. What that means is it gives you infinite options, and choice is not always the best outcome. So when we find ourselves taking advantage of that configuration and flexibility to do something, there will be decisions that challenge us to decide whether we want to prioritize simplicity or we want to prioritize fit for purpose, something more bespoke. Prioritizing simplicity really helps to reduce both the implementation risk and the operational risk. It's oftentimes a challenging thing to do, but it's the right thing to do because it means that we don't wind up with something that's so variant that we can't scale for support, that we can't adapt to the business needs. And the last bullet speaks to migration, and the whole next slide actually speaks to migration. Because in migration, what we're talking about is the SAS assets, the supporting infrastructure, the people and the processes, all the things we illustrated right at the beginning of this when we said what's involved in SAS, what's involved in modernization. Planning for the migration is an activity that you can start too late. And what I mean by that is there's usually a bridge period where SAS will allow clients to have their legacy environment sort of running in parallel. But in order to get the licensing efficiencies, you want to minimize that and you want to get through the migration as quickly as possible. You don't have to wait until the build is done to start thinking about how am I going to move my files and what changes might I need to make to my code. You obviously need the implementation done in order to test those things, but you certainly don't need it done to start thinking about it and start planning for it and even start doing some of it. So our lesson learned here is really that it's important to acknowledge that migration is high risk and it can start too late. And we encourage folks to start early. It's one of the things we put right at the beginning of a project. And the reason we do it is because of the things that are illustrated here. The adoption timing is a three-dimensional problem. It's technology and people and projects. So I mentioned earlier you might have a user who supports two different business processes and therefore uses two different systems and two different sets of code, maybe even two different sets of data, because they're working on two different drugs or they're working in two different areas. When you make the decision to say this business unit or this project will go live, that decision can't be made in a vacuum because the technology, the assets, and the people need to be migrated. They need to be modified. They need to be trained. So regardless of how you try to segment this, it is a three-dimensional problem, and all three dimensions need appropriate attention in thinking about how to move people forward. When we go through the technical analysis of the old code and the old data, so there's often a desire to sort of take a broad brushstrokes approach, look at things at a very surface level. Our experience is the migration dependency analysis really must include code and data review to be successful. Now, there are ways to automate this. It can be scripted to create an inventory of things that need to be done. But people that write SAS code use it to do lots of things. Some people will create code that actually uses non-SAS technologies. They'll run separate scripts or PDF generators. In other cases, you'll have systems that have integration dependencies. And only by profiling them can you come up with the right technical notes to tell people, these are the things you're going to need to do to your code when it's moved into the new environment. And if it turns out that you don't have the resources to do that, or you don't have the expertise to do that, it allows you to plan to have it done for the users ahead of time. We think that it's important to prioritize the early effort to identify known and unknown technical challenges and create the right migration strategies. And the next bullet about pilot exercises really speaks to this same point. As opposed to just letting everybody go live and figure out what happens, one of the best practices we find is to take a collection of sort of super users or representative users from each of the different groups and go through a planned pilot to give them sort of a first couple days on the grid experience where we can test that the technical notes we produced in the migration dependency analysis resulted in the right changes. And then we didn't find something new that all of the users will then learn unexpectedly when they go live. Pilot exercises are a really potent way to surface these unknowns because inevitably there will be unknowns, and the only way to find them is to bump into them. And the last two bullets speak to the planning of the adoption lifecycle. And it's really just sort of referencing some previous comments that when you think about the current lifecycle of a project, how close it is to completion, how long will the legacy platform be necessary, those things should be top of mind in determining adoption timing. And when you stack all of these different adoption phases up against each other, the optimal outcome is to provide maximum flexibility. And that's just to minimize the risk to business timelines. If you put yourself under pressure during the late stage of an implementation when people are going live, it just creates a lot of unnecessary burden that could have been avoided by planning with flexibility in mind. So DWise has been in the business of advising clients through the life cycle of internal alignment and informed decision-making for quite some time. And our experience with this is that the modernization life cycle starts with and sort of is rooted in a correct business case and justification for modernization, and then doing the planning that allows it to be successful. It requires the business get aligned on a decision and a plan. It requires coming up with that plan so that you can build and adopt. Recognizing that it's not just building a new system, it's migrating the legacy estate, planning to scale, because inevitably the goal here is to create something that's agile and scalable and meets future needs, and creates a platform in which you can introduce new technologies. And across the entire pattern, navigating change is important. Again, we're talking here about the people. A lot of times it's easy to say things are widgets, processes are interchangeable. People are people, and they require some care and feeding in order to go through any experience like this. Doesn't mean that that exercise has to be overbearing, but it can't be ignored. And if it is ignored, it probably won't result in the adoption experience that we want. So we're wrapping up towards the conclusion of the presentation. We've got a slide here that's going to speak to licensing options. And as I pull it up, we've got the blue pill and the red pill illustrated here, which basically sets the right context that you only really get to make one choice. You won't implement all three of these or even two out of the three. Ideally, you just align on one. And picking the right one is important. So as I mentioned before, DWise isn't writing licenses for SAS. We're just relaying here what we've seen with our clients about the flavors of licenses that exist and some of the things that are good consideration factors as you compare and contrast them. So the three different models we're going to talk about are core-based SAS or grid SAS, server-based SAS, and PC-based SAS, which is the SAS that you would commonly have on your desktop that's unique to the individual user. We already talked about the fact that there's some variance in these, but grid SAS is an architecture that's constrained by the number of processing cores you might have. So when you buy a laptop, maybe it's a quad-core Pentium processor from Intel. That quad core means there are 4 cores. And when you buy an enterprise-class server, there's a very similar situation. You buy a server with a specific number of cores. Maybe you even buy multiple servers with a specific number of cores. Grid's license structure is aligned more to the number of cores than the specific machines. Whereas the server-based architecture in the third column really is more about the specific server. So obviously SAS wants to know the configuration of the machine. Does it have 12 cores? Does it have 48 cores? Obviously, those create a different level of capacity. But to really have fluidity to move things around, a grid-based license, because it's constrained by cores, gives you this very different paradigm where you cannot use more than a specific number of cores, but where those cores exist and how you might deploy them is a little bit less constrained. PC-based licensing obviously deploys directly to a desktop, so there is no real notion of cores or servers here. It's just how many PCs do you have, be they desktops or laptops. how many licenses do you have therefore. So moving down to the third row, we're going to talk a little bit about agility. I mentioned that LSF Grid is a platform built from the ground up with configuration in mind and with scalability in mind. What it does in order to create agility is it provides features by way of a web-based platform to on-demand reallocate capacity and provision which resources are available to which people and in which order of priority. Separately from that, it allows you to bring online and take offline pieces of the infrastructure in a very point-by-point sort of fashion. So you don't have to bring a whole server offline to make a change. You can bring one of the nodes offline. I haven't really talked about what nodes are, but a node is the grouping of cores that actually is the SAS compute resources. So a grid is a grouping of multiple nodes, 2 nodes, 4 nodes, maybe even 20 nodes. You don't have to take all the nodes offline at any given time. You can take 2 nodes offline, perform maintenance on them, keep 80%, maybe 90% of your capacity online. That creates a lot of agility. In a server-based platform, you have something that's a little bit more constrained in the sense of agility because you can move users between servers, but you can't really allocate where the capacity is. So if you have capacity on the East Coast that allows access to certain data and something different on the West Coast, you can move users between servers, but you can't really move data between servers. There's a fundamentally different amount of agility in a grid-based license because of the way it's architected. PC-based licensing right on the desktop, again, not agile. When you need a new license, you need a new license, and there's a really binary activity happening here. You either do or you don't have it. It's really hard to call that agile. From an availability point of view, people like their SaaS environments to be performant, but also not go offline. Core-based licensing, as I've mentioned, it has these features built in from the ground up. So in order to do maintenance, in order to provide for disaster recovery, there are features you can take advantage of. And what that means is you have to configure those features, but you don't have to design them. You don't have to create them. In server-based licensing, you get some clustering options, but that really just creates high availability via redundancy. Virtualization is another strategy people take in server patterns to create high availability. And again, I'm using the word create here. These aren't features that are baked into the platform. They're features that you get by virtue of doing something intentional. Grid's a little bit different. There are features in the platform that you get out of the box that help you to create an environment that's highly available. In the PC world, the only option for high availability is really spare laptops or sort of a common lab where people might be able to go and access a controlled version of SAS. Again, it's hard to call that highly available, but it is better than not having it because the alternative is that when my laptop dies, I can't get online. And the last points are around scalability. So in a grid-based licensing model, I mentioned this notion of nodes. Perhaps you start out with 12 cores, 16 cores, and you have 4 nodes, and then next year you have an acquisition, and your compute needs double. It's very easy to add nodes, and therefore more cores and more capacity in a grid-based license. Again, there are features baked in that allow this to be easy to do. It doesn't result in an entirely fresh implementation. It's an incremental implementation. And oftentimes, SAS will even pre-negotiate the terms for additional cores within some duration, which means that when you buy it today, you don't have to buy the capacity you're going to need 5 years down the road. You can buy the capacity you're going to need for the next 24 months. And if it turns out that you underinvested, you can add more, and you know what it's going to cost you to do that. And you can make an informed decision about that because you have the pricing details. Server licensing is a little different because it's a function of the server that you would actually run on. So until you would know the hardware profile that you would deploy your SAS license to, you can't really get very deep in a negotiation cycle for a new license. And that is what you have to do in order to bring a new server online to scale. You have to renegotiate or procure a new license because it is genuinely a new implementation. The PC-based world, again, it's hard to call this scalable. SAS often provides PC licenses in bundles, maybe 50 at a time, maybe 150 at a time, depending on the size of your organization. And in order to scale, you just have to buy another bundle. You have to buy another collection of laptops. It's very hard to build out shared capacity that would be broadly available to the enterprise. I'm sure there might be some questions on this as we get to the end, but we're going to go ahead and move through to the conclusion and take some of those questions. So if you'd like some more information, there are 3 links advertised here on the slides, and then we're going to talk a little bit about DWise's Verify offering. DWise attends lots of conferences, both SAS conferences and industry conferences, where we have collateral we can give you and people that can talk to you about what we do for the clinical industry, what are our advisory services, and there's actually a landing page on our website where you can go to find that sort of content and download some of the white papers that might be interesting for you to discuss with your peers. We have a page dedicated to SAS Grid where we talk specifically about SAS Grid, but modernization for some organizations doesn't mean SAS Grid. Some people have a dozen users, they're all on the PC, and they're just growing to a point where that's no longer sustainable or manageable. That may not be the right time in the life cycle to think about going straight to Grid. Maybe a server is the right next step. So again, there's a landing page where we talk about Grid specifically. In between the two, we've introduced this concept of DWise's Verify offering. And what we've created here is this idea that there are so many pieces of this puzzle that sometimes it can feel a little bit overwhelming to even know where to start. And so given that DWise has done this exercise with a number of clients and we've helped them to move through the life cycle of modernization decision making, we can come in and have a half-day workshop with your organization, with the right stakeholders, to help facilitate some discussion on what the next steps might be if we want to think about modernization this year, or what the next steps might be in order to get ready if we think we might be ready to do it next year. So Verify is our branded offering that allows us to come in and do that. And it's generally structured as a half-day workshop, but it can be aligned to your preferences. We can do a 2-hour WebEx. We could do a 3-day on-site. But generally, a half-day workshop is a good window of time to go through some of the considerations and help create a good platform for next steps. And so if you hit any of those links on the DWise website, you're going to have the opportunity to download materials or request to speak to an account manager, and you can email any of us as well, and we'd be glad to connect you with one of our account leads who can help connect you with the right people internally to get more expertise and more information, or talk about how DWise might be able to help you down the modernization path. And that concludes our content portion of the presentation. So at this point, we're going to open it up for questions. Dave, I think you might be managing the panel, so I'll let you go ahead and tell me what folks have said. And as folks have questions, please go ahead and put them in. We'll address as many of them as we can.
All right. Thanks very much, Stevie. I appreciate you taking the time to put together this session for this morning. There are some questions that have come in through the questions box on GoToWebinar site or GoToWebinar application. I'm going to ask you those in just a second. And I think at the end, we'll try to open up the audio for anybody else that wants to ask a question. We'll see how that works as well. So the first question that I've seen is SAS for drug development the same as Grid SAS?
That's a good question. SAS drug development is one of the offerings that SAS has in their clinical portfolio. It's a web delivered offering that has a server behind the scenes. It provides a sort of out-of-the-box, turnkey, validated environment, but it also has some feature assumptions, how you would store files, how you would manage your workflow. It is not the same thing as SAS Grid. The two are totally unrelated. So you could buy SAS drug development from SAS and use it for your statistical computing platform. You could alternatively buy SAS Grid and deploy it either locally or in a host or cloud facility or even directly at SAS and construct your statistical computing environment fit for purpose using SAS Grid. So they are not the same, and you would not have to license both in order to get either. They're separate decisions.
Thank you. So another question is related to the migration process. So if you're currently using PC SAS at your company, do you have to go step by step from PC SAS to server SAS and then to Grid?
You most certainly don't. That's a great question. We had the opportunity to work with actually 2 CROs in the last 24 months who were using PC SAS exclusively, one at a much larger scale than the other. One had hundreds of users, the other had thousands of users. Both went directly to Grid without taking that middle step to a server because they had actually just dramatically outlived the utility of the old license that they had. This is really a scaling question. So when Grid is right, it's because the agility needs and the scaling needs and also the administrative needs merit something that has features to allow for that. There's a point in time in the life cycle of the growth of a company where a server might be just enough, and it's a step beyond the PC, but it's not quite the end of the road, and it would work for a few years, and then you can come back and revisit the decision. But you don't have to go directly to grid. Our Verify assessment workshop can really help to examine what your readiness is for something different, and whether that something different should include both server and grid as options, or if it's very obvious and natural that only one or the other is relevant to think about.
Thank you. Another question is, if a company has already made a decision to move to a SAS grid environment, are there still opportunities to engage with DWIs to do just the implementation work?
Absolutely, Dave. That's we spoke to our modernization methodology into the life cycle earlier. Some of our clients bring us in right at the beginning of decision making, and so we're either working with their procurement groups or their business groups to get the organization ready to make a decision about what the future should look like. In other cases, the license is already done. Maybe an organization decided to buy grid, and they decided to buy 32 cores of grid, and they need a design. And we can come in and do the design, and we can take on the subsequent activities if desired. We could also come in after a design is done and give our input on whether or not the design is the right one and move forward with implementation. We could even come in for the migration phase. There's no obligation when you would interface with DWIs that we would have a full life cycle. We can pick the right pieces to meet your needs.
All right, I've got one more question that's come in through the application, and then we'll try opening it up to see if anybody else has a question. So the last question is, what is the experience like for users moving from PC SAS to a server or grid environment?
That's a great question. This must have come from somebody who is either a PC SAS user or has been through this experience before. PC SAS is a localized environment. And what that means is that the data you would access and the compute activities that would take place, they happen locally. There's a little bit of a mental change to acknowledging how that's different in the server, but it's an easy thing to train people on. The biggest difference is in the client interface itself. The PC SAS is often called Display Manager SAS. It's got a very familiar window that people know and like. It has keyboard shortcuts they may know and like. And when you move to a server, it's not an obligation, but it's a strong recommendation that you would abandon that Display Manager experience and do something that is either delivered via the web with SAS Studio or delivered via Enterprise Guide. Some folks also write and edit code using text editors like SlickEdit or UltraEdit and submit their code in batch. But inevitably what they're doing here is they're changing their experience from being Display Manager SAS to something else. All of the same features exist. Many new features that are actually quite beneficial to users exist. But this is one of the places where you're going to experience resistance to change because people prefer the thing they already know as opposed to the thing that they don't, even if that new thing might be an improvement. And so there's a training exercise necessary and an analysis of the business SAS user experience necessary to create a training program that can get people ready at the right time. And once they are ready, the adoption process can be quite strong. So that CRO that we mentioned a minute ago working with, we transitioned hundreds of PC users to Enterprise Guide with a highly successful and on-time adoption that allowed them to get everybody moving forward. One of the other things, I guess, to think about here is there's oftentimes a desire to have right mouse button functionality. This isn't something that manifests naturally in the interface, but locally on your desktop, you can right-click on SAS code and run it. And when you move to a server pattern, that happens a little differently. When you move to a grid pattern, it again happens a little bit differently. So people who are familiar with doing that because they've been using it on the PC just need to be educated about how that experience is available to them in a new environment. And once they're familiar with it, they can adapt to the new process, and oftentimes they find that it's a little bit better.
All right, thanks, Stephen. I'm going to open up the lines and see if anybody wants to ask a question directly. appreciate the fact that we've exhausted our questions for today. I do want to mention that the webinar has been recorded. It will be available in about 48 hours. Those folks that have obviously registered will get alerted to that. And I want to thank everybody for their time today in terms of participating, for presenting, and for joining us as we explain how SAS can be modernized and some of the opportunities around doing so in a way that really fosters improved capabilities and bringing your environment up to a much more current approach as you look at licensing and other opportunities to improve your business process.
So DWise,
thank you all very much.
Yep. DWise would be very happy if you could invite us in to help you go through that experience and bring our expertise to bear. We would look forward to the opportunity to chat with you, and you can reach out on our website to connect with one of our account managers if that's desirable.
Right. Thank you all very much.